The investigation was already closed long before anyone asked me to read the files. Officially, there was no missing person, no murder, and no public danger. But one handwritten note inside a locked ranger cabin suggested someone had been there who was never part of the investigation. The investigation had already been closed by the time I was asked to review it, which is probably why I noticed details that everyone involved had stopped looking at months earlier. I was 47 then, working as a training coordinator for a national forest district in western Montana after nearly 2 decades as a field ranger. My normal job involved evaluating incident reports from newer employees and identifying procedural lessons before the next season began. Every winter, I'd receive stacks of patrol logs, radio transcripts, maintenance records, and search summaries from across the forest. Most cases were straightforward. This one arrived in 3 boxes marked administrative review only. No criminal charges, no missing person, no unresolved public safety threat. Officially, the file existed simply because several reports didn't quite agree with one another. The incident centered on a remote backcountry ranger cabin that overlooked a junction where 2 wilderness trails met an old logging road permanently closed to vehicles. The cabin stayed staffed only during the busiest months, but in early November, a veteran seasonal ranger named Eric had been assigned there alone for 5 nights to finish trail closure work before winter. His daily responsibilities were routine: remove summer permit boxes, secure bridge tools, photograph washed-out sections of trail, winterize the water pump, inventory emergency caches, and complete scheduled evening radio check-ins. His written reports during the first 2 days were almost painfully ordinary: wind speeds, snow depth, visitor contacts, 1 broken gate hinge, a pair of overdue horse campers who eventually checked out safely. Nothing unusual. Then, halfway through the 3rd day, the paperwork began drifting in directions that never fully came back together. According to Eric's patrol log, he found a pickup truck parked beyond the wilderness boundary, where motor vehicles weren't permitted. The truck wasn't abandoned. It had fresh mud on the tires, warm engine components, and no license plates. Instead of approaching immediately, he documented the location, photographed tire impressions, and radioed dispatch. Unfortunately, an approaching snow squall blocked communications before dispatch could acknowledge the transmission. He decided to continue on foot, expecting the occupants were probably hunters who had ignored seasonal closures. About half a mile beyond the vehicle, he located an empty campsite. The fire pit was cold. 2 canvas tarps had been folded neatly against a fallen log. Coffee grounds remained in a metal cup that was still damp enough to suggest someone had left only recently. Oddly, there were no sleeping bags, food containers, or discarded packaging, none of the clutter people usually leave behind even during brief camps. Eric's report included one handwritten observation that caught my attention immediately, because it wasn't something investigators emphasized later. He wrote that every boot print around the camp had been brushed with a pine branch after people walked through, softening their edges without completely hiding them. It was the sort of careful effort someone might make if they understood trackers looked for heel pressure and stride length. Eric ended the entry by noting that he heard an engine somewhere below the ridge while returning to the cabin but never located its source. Dispatch logs confirmed they eventually regained contact that evening. Eric reported the unauthorized vehicle and requested law enforcement assistance for the following morning. Officers planned to arrive after daylight because heavy snow made a nighttime approach unsafe. During his scheduled radio check that night, Eric also mentioned finding one unfamiliar item inside the ranger cabin, a laminated trail map lying on the office desk that wasn't part of station inventory. Nobody remembered issuing it. The map looked ordinary except for several narrow pencil lines connecting maintenance roads closed years earlier. Investigators photographed it later but never identified who left it behind. Overnight, conditions deteriorated. Snow accumulated faster than forecast, covering roads and reducing visibility across the valley. Law enforcement reached the trailhead late the next morning only to discover the unauthorized pickup gone. Fresh tire tracks led downhill before disappearing where county road crews had already plowed the highway. Eric, meanwhile, had started retracing his previous day's patrol on snowshoes to determine whether the campsite occupants remained nearby. His body camera recorded nearly 4 hours of routine trail work before something subtle changed. Reviewing the footage months later, I noticed it first. Birds had been active throughout the morning, especially gray jays that regularly approached hikers for scraps. Then, almost without warning, every background sound disappeared, except wind. Eric never commented on it. He was busy examining a broken trail sign someone had deliberately rotated to point toward an unmaintained drainage instead of the official route. While repairing the sign, he discovered fresh snowshoe tracks leading away from the trail. He assumed they belonged to the same group connected with the pickup and followed them cautiously. The tracks continued for nearly a mile before ending abruptly beside a frozen creek. They didn't double back. They didn't continue across the ice. Wind couldn't have erased them because surrounding animal tracks remained visible. Investigators later determined the snow had drifted unevenly around exposed rock, allowing the remaining impressions to vanish naturally. But Eric's uncertainty came through clearly in a recording. He circled the area methodically before abandoning the search and returning toward the cabin as daylight faded. The final hours unfolded through overlapping evidence rather than direct observation. His written log stated that someone had entered the cabin while he was away but taken nothing. The wood stove had been restocked with split pine. Wet gloves he had left hanging near the door had been moved closer to the fire. A kettle sat on the stove, filled with fresh water from the hand pump. Every door and window remained locked when he returned. Investigators initially suspected Eric had simply forgotten arranging those items himself after a long day in worsening weather. Then they compared his body camera footage from that morning. The stove had been cold when he left. The wood box nearly empty. The kettle sitting upside down on a shelf. Something or someone had plainly altered the cabin during his absence. The next morning, officers finally searched the surrounding area in force. They found no camps, no vehicles, and no additional tracks except one surprising discovery, nearly 2 miles away at an abandoned Forest Service bridge closed for years. Hidden beneath weathered planks were food supplies, spare fuel, winter clothing, portable radios, and counterfeit contractor identification cards bearing different company names. Investigators concluded the site had been used as a temporary staging area by organized thieves, moving stolen equipment between counties through isolated public lands while avoiding highways. The theory explained the unauthorized truck, the altered trail sign, and the misleading map. Several arrests followed months later in another state after unrelated cargo theft investigations uncovered matching equipment. Administratively, the file was closed as a successful interagency case. My review wasn't meant to reopen it. I was only supposed to identify training lessons for future rangers. Even so, one inconsistency refused to settle. Among the maintenance records was a handwritten cabin inventory Eric completed immediately after discovering someone had entered the station. Every listed item matched previous inventories exactly, except one line added at the bottom in different handwriting. It read simply, "Lantern cleaned." Nobody questioned it because the lantern hanging beside the door had, in fact, been cleaned. During my review, I enlarged the scanned page and compared the handwriting with every statement collected during the investigation. It matched none of the suspects, none of the responding officers, none of the supervisors, and not Eric himself. The line had been written before the document was archived, using the same pencil found on the cabin desk. Whatever happened inside that ranger cabin was considered explained well enough to close the investigation, but someone had handled an official inventory sheet inside a locked building before the evidence ever left the mountain. Added a single maintenance note as though they belonged there, and then disappeared from the record entirely. The first report reached dispatch at 4:18 in the afternoon while I was restocking medical supplies at a remote contact station inside the Mojave National Preserve. I'm like most of the rangers on my district. I wasn't hired through a law enforcement track. I came from emergency communications after almost 15 years coordinating wildfire responses across Southern California. And because I understood radios better than most people in the field, I often worked a station whenever staffing was thin. Looking back, the strange part of that week wasn't any single incident. It was how several unrelated reports slowly fit together only after everyone had already made decisions based on incomplete information. The preserve had entered its quiet season. Visitor numbers dropped sharply after a stretch of unusually hot weather, leaving long gravel roads empty for hours at a time. My routine revolved around checking repeater status, logging weather updates, answering permit questions for backcountry campers, and relaying information to patrol units spread across hundreds of square miles where cellular coverage barely existed. Shortly before closing, a volunteer campground host radioed that someone wearing what looked like a ranger uniform had advised 2 campers to leave a remote site because of an alleged gas leak from an abandoned mining shaft. The explanation made little sense. There were old mines in the preserve, but none anywhere near that campground, and no ranger had been assigned there that afternoon. I assumed it was either a misunderstanding or someone wearing outdoor clothing that resembled a uniform. I noted the report and called the nearest patrol unit, but they were already more than an hour away, investigating an unrelated disabled vehicle. Before anyone could follow up, another transmission arrived from a maintenance employee repairing fencing along an isolated service road. He had passed a white utility truck with a magnetic government-style emblem on both doors, yet the truck carried civilian license plates. He hadn't thought much about it until the driver waved him away from the road without stopping to identify himself. The maintenance worker only became suspicious after realizing the emblem looked unusually plain, missing the lettering normally surrounding official agency seals. By then, the truck had disappeared into a maze of old ranch roads beyond radio range. The timing seemed odd, but not enough to justify pulling every ranger away from active calls. We documented both reports and moved on. Around sunset, I completed the scheduled equipment check inside the communications room. The backup generator tested normally. The radio console logged every incoming transmission without error. Weather sensors showed steady wind from the northwest. Everything appeared routine, until I noticed one handheld radio charging in the equipment rack that shouldn't have been there. It belonged to another district nearly 80 miles away. I recognized the identification sticker because those radios were color-coded by region. Assuming someone had borrowed it during a training exercise, I checked the sign-out binder. No record. I called the neighboring district. Their supervisor replied immediately that the radio had been reported missing almost 3 weeks earlier after disappearing from an unattended maintenance vehicle. While we were still discussing that mystery, the supposedly missing radio sitting on my charger suddenly transmitted a burst of static followed by 2 words spoken calmly by a male voice: "Road clear." Then silence, no call sign, no response to repeated requests for identification. The signal strength indicated the transmission originated close enough to hit our station directly, instead of bouncing through a repeater. Law enforcement requested that I leave the radio powered on in case another transmission arrived. None did. The following morning, the district organized a coordinated patrol covering the roads mentioned in both previous reports. I remained at dispatch, tracking vehicle locations while 2 ranger units worked separate sectors. Just after 10, one ranger reported finding temporary tire impressions leading behind an abandoned maintenance yard that had been closed for years. The impressions belonged to multiple vehicles, not one. They ended near several weathered shipping containers left from an old restoration project. Every container was locked, empty, and apparently untouched. Still, one detail stood out. Fresh broom marks crossed the dusty ground around them, as though someone had deliberately swept away footprints without considering that tire tracks would remain visible. Investigators documented everything before continuing the search. About an hour later, another patrol discovered discarded magnetic door emblems hidden beneath creosote bushes less than a mile away. From a distance, they resembled official government markings, but up close they contained subtle mistakes in lettering, spacing, and color. Good enough to convince a passing visitor, not good enough to withstand inspection. That afternoon, dispatch received a complaint from a family who had encountered a uniformed man directing traffic away from a closed scenic road, supposedly because of unstable pavement. The road wasn't damaged. No employee had been stationed there. Fortunately, the family ignored his instructions and continued until they reached a legitimate ranger farther ahead, who immediately realized someone had been impersonating park staff. The preserve shifted from routine patrols to a coordinated investigation. Rangers notified neighboring agencies and maintenance crews checked every locked facility for signs of entry. I spent most of that evening comparing radio traffic with equipment inventories, looking for patterns rather than individual incidents. That's when I noticed every suspicious encounter had occurred within 20 minutes of scheduled ranger radio check-ins. Whoever was moving through the preserve seemed to know exactly when field units would briefly stop traveling to complete communications procedures, creating predictable gaps in road coverage. That knowledge wasn't secret, but it wasn't posted publicly either. The second day produced the first meaningful break. A patrol located the white utility truck abandoned behind an old borrow pit several miles outside the preserve boundary. The magnetic emblems had been removed. Inside, investigators found reflective safety vests, traffic cones, blank permit forms copied from outdated public documents, and printed maps highlighting isolated utility corridors crossing federal and county land. Nothing connected directly to violence or theft, but everything suggested preparation for convincing strangers that the occupants belonged there. Authorities eventually linked several suspects to cargo thefts occurring hundreds of miles apart, where temporary road diversions and false official directions had delayed witnesses long enough for equipment to disappear from construction sites. On paper, the case was considered resolved. The abandoned truck, fake insignia, and recovered gear explained the impersonation reports well enough. Yet one detail stayed with me because it surfaced almost by accident 6 months later. During a scheduled communications audit, I opened a recovered handheld radio from the neighboring district before sending it for reprogramming. Most radios store only recent activity logs. This one contained dozens of deleted channel presets that technicians managed to recover. Mixed among ordinary public safety frequencies was one custom label entered manually by whoever had possessed the radio after it disappeared. It wasn't a frequency name or location. It was the exact nickname my coworkers used for our contact station, a nickname never printed on maps, signs, paperwork, or radio procedures. Only employees who had spent time inside that building ever called it that. The daily work of a ranger is built on routine, records, and practical decisions made far from crowded roads. Every now and then an incident resists a complete explanation, not because it defies reason, but because the piece is in the tide that is not bringing the daily two men. I was 39 when I transferred from a busy visitor services district in Arizona to a remote trail management station in the Gila National Forest of New Mexico. And the change felt almost like changing professions, because instead of answering questions it overlooks, I spent most of my days alone checking trail conditions, clearing fallen timber, replacing boundary signs, updating permit boards at wilderness trailheads, and making sure isolated backcountry cabins still had functioning emergency radios before winter storms arrived. The station itself sat at the end of a gravel Forest Service road, with one maintenance shed, a small office, 2 fuel tanks, and a radio mast that worked well only after sunrise, because the surrounding ridges blocked the signal during early morning hours. It was late October when our district supervisor assigned me to verify reports that several unofficial camps had appeared inside a restricted burn recovery zone closed to the public after a wildfire 2 years earlier. Illegal camping happened often enough that nobody viewed the assignment as unusual. I left before daylight with a chainsaw, extra fuel, trail markers, and enough supplies to stay overnight if weather delayed my return. Frost covered the grass around the station, and the first thing I noticed before even starting the truck was a fresh entry in the sign-out clipboard hanging beside the office door. Someone had written my truck number beside the previous afternoon's date. I assumed the clerk had made a paperwork mistake because my vehicle hadn't moved in 3 days while its transmission was being serviced. I crossed out the incorrect line, signed beneath it, and drove into the forest while thinking more about the weather than the paperwork. By mid-morning, I reached the burn area where young pines were beginning to reclaim blackened hillsides. Most of the old trail markers had faded from constant sunlight, so I stopped several times to replace reflective tabs and update mileage plates. Around noon, I found the first campsite. There was no tent, no food, no fire ring. Just 4 folding chairs arranged around bare ground and an empty blue water jug standing upright beside them. The chairs were dry despite overnight frost, suggesting they had been placed there after sunrise. Yet there were almost no footprints because the ground consisted of coarse volcanic gravel. I photographed everything, logged GPS coordinates, and packed the chairs into the truck bed to remove them later. Less than a mile farther along, I found another odd detail. Someone had tied narrow strips of faded survey tape around trees, but instead of marking a route, they pointed hikers toward unstable slopes closed after the fire. The knots were identical, looped twice before being cinched tight, the same method we used during official trail projects because it stayed secure in strong wind. I removed each ribbon while updating my field notebook. By early afternoon, clouds gathered unexpectedly from the west, bringing colder air than forecast. My scheduled radio check at 2 o'clock barely reached dispatch through static. I reported the abandoned campsite and the false trail markers. Dispatch acknowledged both, then added one piece of information that changed my priorities. Another ranger from a neighboring district had reported seeing a green Forest Service pickup in the same restricted area earlier that morning. The vehicle number matched the incorrect truck number someone had written on my station clipboard. According to fleet records, that truck had been auctioned off almost 6 years earlier after an engine fire. Dispatch assumed a witness had misread the faded numbers while driving past. I accepted that explanation because it sounded reasonable, but I wrote it into my notebook anyway. Rain arrived before I reached the old Fireline Road where I planned to spend the night in a patrol cabin. The road turned slick enough that I decided to stop early and inspect a locked equipment cache before the storm intensified. The padlock remained intact, yet inside, I immediately noticed that one shelf had been wiped clean of dust, while everything around it carried a thick gray layer. Nothing was missing according to inventory. Someone had simply moved equipment, cleaned the shelf accidentally or intentionally, and returned every item to its original place. That bothered me more than theft would have, because it suggested familiarity rather than opportunity. I radioed another update, but the storm had settled into the canyon, and every transmission dissolved into bursts of static. With daylight fading faster beneath heavy clouds, I continued to the patrol cabin. The building overlooked a narrow valley where old logging grades disappeared into thick timber. I unloaded supplies, checked the propane heater, inspected window latches, started the small generator long enough to recharge handheld batteries, and completed my written log by lantern light. Just after sunset, I heard an engine somewhere below the ridge, not approaching, idling. It continued for perhaps 5 minutes before shutting off. I stepped outside with binoculars, but rain and low cloud erased the valley below. Sound traveled strangely there. I couldn't judge distance. Sometime after midnight, the rain stopped. Wind replaced it. Loose tin roofing on the maintenance woodshed tapped softly until I finally got out of bed to secure it. While tightening the latch with a wrench, my flashlight beam crossed the muddy track leading to the cabin. There were fresh tire impressions that hadn't been there when I arrived. They ended beside the woodshed, reversed direction, and left again without anyone knocking on the cabin door or attempting to enter. The tread pattern matched an older government-style utility tire, no longer issued by our district. I measured the width before the wind dried the mud and went back inside. Sleep came only in short stretches because I expected someone might return. At first light, I followed the tracks downhill until they merged with an abandoned administrative road closed by concrete barriers years earlier. The barriers were still in place. The vehicle had bypassed them by driving through a shallow wash that most visitors would never notice. Beyond that point, I found something I almost overlooked because it blended with the damp soil. A crushed paper map corner protruded beneath sagebrush. When I pulled it free, I recognized it immediately. It was one of our internal maintenance maps showing radio dead zones, water storage sites, seasonal staffing cabins, and locked service gates. Those maps were never distributed to the public. The corner that should have identified the district office had been carefully torn away. I marked the location and drove back toward the station without finishing the remaining inspections because this had become more than a campsite investigation. Law enforcement officers met me halfway along the forest road. Together we returned to the wash crossing, but overnight runoff had already softened the tire tracks beyond useful comparison. Investigators searched for several days, locating more abandoned camps arranged in the same peculiar way with empty chairs and water containers, but almost no ordinary camping equipment. Eventually, they concluded that unknown individuals had likely been using restricted roads to scout isolated routes for transporting stolen property while staging temporary meeting points that appeared abandoned if discovered. The explanation accounted for nearly everything except one administrative detail that surfaced months later. During the records audit, our fleet manager asked whether I remembered correcting the sign-out clipboard on the morning the investigation began. I told him I did. He handed me the original sheet preserved with the case file. The line I had crossed out was still visible underneath my initials, but the truck number wasn't the only thing written there. Faintly, almost erased by the ink I drew across it, was a destination beside the old vehicle number. It wasn't the burn area where I had been assigned. It was the patrol cabin where I chose to spend the night only after the storm forced me to change my plans.